Ideological. And then let's get rid of that. Zoom in there. All right, so the question was asked, hey, can you talk about the difference between contemporary and classical liberalism? And my first response will be, you are going to be seeing the word contemporary contemporary liberalism almost never. It's going to be referred to as modern liberalism. So let's get away. Let's like garbage that term contemporary liberalism, and let's replace that with modern liberalism. So really the question is, can you distinguish between modern liberalism and classical liberalism? And liberalism is this philosophy, this ideology, right? The way we see the world, it's about progress, right? That is liberalism. The idea that we should apply new solutions to old problems. It's about innovation. It's about the assumption here is mankind is reasonable. Mankind is rational, and therefore if we unleash the creativity of mankind, then as a species, we might be able to create new solutions to problems as we encounter them. And they might even be old problems like hunger and things like that. So the idea of liberalism is this faith in our human nature to be innovative, reasonable, and rational enough to resolve maybe long-standing issues by coming up with something a little more creative, a little more new than just say feudalism or trust in the king or trust in God. So that's liberalism in general. Modern liberalism and classical liberalism, it's not really a political part of liberalism, not really a social part. So when we're trying to distinguish between classical and modern liberalism, we're not talking about, okay, classic liberalism is a democracy where only rich white guys rule and modern liberalism is a democracy for everyone. That's a little muddy. That's a little muddy. Although that's what the answer would be politically, that's a little muddy. Socially, classic liberalism would be like society controlled by men. Modern liberalism would be a society where we have many, many different genders. That's just one layer of it socially. But again, that's muddy too. When you see classical and modern liberalism, and when you have them contrasted, it's an economic contrast. So even though there's a political and social nuance that you could see, you're kind of getting distracted from what it actually is. It's an economic idea. Classic liberalism economically, that's Adam Smith. That's laissez-faire. Laissez-faire, what does it mean? Leave them alone. So what is classic liberalism? What is the role of government in classic liberalism? Hands off the economy. Freedom from government is classic liberalism. Economic freedom from government. Economic freedom, page 71, one of the principles of individualism is classic liberalism. Self-interest is classic liberalism. Let me be guided by the invisible hand, and I will be able to best deal with my own economic issues like scarcity. Classic liberalism is capitalism. Modern liberalism is a mix of capitalism and some socialism. So by the midpoint of the 20th century, governments in Canada, the United States, they started playing a more involved role in the economy. Instead of just hands off the economy, they began to put their hands on the economy. And therefore, modern liberalism is most often best defined as not freedom from, but freedom through government. Freedom through government. And the best way to understand modern liberalism is to think about the Great Depression. So during the Great Depression, if the government under Prime Minister Bennett in Canada or the government under President Herbert Hoover in the United States, if they practiced capitalism, and they did, then poverty wasn't their concern. You're living in poverty, self-interest should deal with that. Economic freedom should deal with that. It's not the government's problem. We will not provide a solution. But because the poverty, because the depression was so great, and the poverty was so life-changing, government could no longer be a bystander to your economic hardship. They had to get involved. So now it's not freedom from government, it's freedom through government. Government decided, it's a paradigm shift in government. They decide in order for you to be free, we must help you. Freedom through government. government in the United States is going to provide relief, recovery, reform through FDR's alphabet agencies that really are a new deal. A new deal is, here's the old deal, classic liberalism. A new deal, modern liberalism. Still liberalism. Remember the umbrella liberalism. Let's try something new to old problems. Poverty is still an old problem. Something new is maybe government does need to create welfare. Maybe government does need to have hot lunches for people that are unfed, right? People that have no food. Maybe government does need to create jobs. Maybe they need to be an employer. Maybe they need to be a regulator of prices. Maybe they need to make things like minimum wage. So you're definitely going to see that. Get the back door. There's two students walking. Modern liberalism, therefore, is a mix of individualism and some collectivism, some socialism. And the reality here is that, oh, I thought they were coming up. My bad. They must have walked by. Yeah. So that's the one question that I had. What's the difference between classic and modern liberalism? And again, there is a political nuance. When we look at the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we have a list of rights. You have the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, you have language rights, you have legal rights. These are all rights as outlined by the government. So you could argue there's a political nuance that we only have those rights because of the government's involvement through a constitution. That's not as clear. That is not as clear. So when you have to unpack the difference between classic and modern liberalism, think of it economically. Think of classic liberalism as Adam Smith, invisible hand, self-interest, economic freedom, private property, competition, all of those things on page 71 that are economic. And modern liberalism is the government saying, you know what? We need to take a collective responsibility here through government for each other's poverty. That we need to look at the common good. We need to look at the collective interest. We need to, as those clovers, we can't allow this one three-leaf clover to be sitting there, in hardship. That the other four-leaf clovers need to help that three-leaf clover, and the best vehicle to help them is through government. So in -2, in assignment 2, you always have sources, and then the question will be, what is the role of individual or government in light of the problem shown? So the problem shown might be that cartoon where there's, economic inequality is basically the problem being presented within the cartoon. And therefore, you're meant to be able to unpack all these government programs in a modern liberal society where the state helps people living in poverty. In Canada, we have things like CERB checks during COVID-19 that help those three-leaf clovers among us to make it through the pandemic. We have AISH, assisted housing and assisted living in Alberta for those living in poverty. That's an example of government intervention on behalf of those three-leaf clovers among us. We have bursaries and grants for impoverished students to go to college, to go to university, to get leveled up, to power up, to get educated so that they can, pull themselves out of poverty, but they pull themselves with the aid of government. That there's bursaries and scholarships available to low-income earners, low-income houses that people in the middle or upper class cannot qualify for. These are just beginnings of government programs. There's subsidies in place. We have minimum wage so that you're not a three-leaf clover because someone's keeping you at three-leaf because they're exploiting you, paying you $2 an hour. In Canada, we have a minimum wage. Maybe we should be doing more. Maybe we shouldn't have a separate minimum wage for teenagers than we have for adults. That's an idea that maybe we need to shift even more towards collectivism. That, again, liberalism is about redefining what is the role of government and citizen based upon new problems. Maybe a problem that we have right now is the economic exploitation and marginalization of teenagers in Alberta. And therefore, the government has to rethink the idea of a graduated minimum wage where you can pay teenagers less than adults. So that is the answer to the one question I had. Any other questions? Now, classic liberalism and modern liberalism, those terms are 2 of the 7 terms that you may write an A1 about in -2. So -2 students, I have an A1 assignment waiting for you in classroom. And you're meant to do that. There's one that says this is not optional. And there's exemplars of how to do an A1. And in fact, the A1 that you have to do for me is on the same topic of some of the exemplars. And that is one of the marks that's going into Power School. So that is something that you should be able to do now after lessons 1 to 4. Now, in the -1 stream, you don't have a question that is as blatant as, what are the principles of individualism or collectivism or modern liberalism or classic liberalism like the -2s do. But when you do an A1, you're meant to identify, oh, this source is celebrating classic liberalism, or this source is challenging classic liberalism and suggesting we need to evolve into modern liberalism. One of the relationships that we see in an A1 set, especially an economic one, is the evolution of the role of government in the economy to show that it starts in classic liberalism, then there's these problems, then they have to go to modern liberalism. And then as we see with chapter 6 and 8, modern liberalism is going to have problems too. So we're going to keep evolving. So we're going to go from classic to modern liberalism, and then people are going to say, let's go back. And we call them neoclassical liberals, like Reagan. So we might have a set in an economic source that shows this evolution of the role of the state in the economy, going from laissez-faire, classic liberalism, towards modern liberalism, like FDR's New Deal. And then you have Reagan saying, we have to do less because people are becoming so dependent. We've created a culture of dependence upon government. So we need to go back towards Adam Smith. So that is a 13-minute answer to one question that we had. So again, the best thing to do would be to communicate what is it that you need to have answered, because then I am working for you. Otherwise, now I'm kind of stuck generally talking about what we're doing today and what we have done. So I'm going to jump to lesson 1 and talk about what we've done. You should be able to define ideology now, set of beliefs and values, the way you see the world, understand the themes of ideologies. The themes are outlined quite well in the textbook. Compare and contrast individualism and collectivism. That is the course. So in a -2, you've got those A1s that you have to tell me what is individualism and what is collectivism. And you can get it wrong if you pick, say, private property and you think that's collectivism. So you have to be able to distinguish, and that's why pages 71 to 85 are so important in there. But in -1, individualism and collectivism is going to be at the heart of all your writing assignments too. That the source is either going to be celebrating one or challenging one, right? And therefore, that's why we started yesterday with those term projects about democracy and authoritarianism, capitalism and socialism, so that we can begin to compare and contrast economic and political individualism and collectivism. And that's basically it for lesson 1. So let's look at lesson 2. What is liberalism? And that's the best definition I've ever seen of liberalism. That's why it's in a green box. The philosophy of our time, trying not to conserve every tradition of the past, but apply new problems, the old doctrine solutions. We're going to experiment, innovate. Sometimes you get it wrong. Sometimes you experiment. That's what an experiment is. So liberalism isn't about linear progress. There's times when society says, oops, well, I don't like where this is headed. Let's go back a little bit. So that's by nature in liberalism. And we're seeing it globally right now as we see a shift to the right politically and socially, as governments are saying, oh, we've messed up. We've unleashed too much change too quickly. We need to kind of become a little more conservative again. But that is what liberalism is. This is a lesson that really looks at, chapter 2 and 3 of the textbook. Those are chapters that you might read once, and that's it. There's not a lot of testable content in there. As long as we know what liberalism is and begin to understand our cast of characters like Hobbes and Locke. Hobbes and Locke are two of the most overused people in both -1 and -2 on the writing assignments. If it's economic, don't talk about Hobbes and Locke. Talk about Marx and Smith. Hobbes and Locke are just the first two guys that you visit. These are the first two people that we have in our cast of characters. They're not the only two. So it's like we're in the shop class and I'm introducing you to a Phillips screwdriver. And then on day 2, I introduce you to a hammer. And then on day 3, you have to, put some nails into a piece of plywood, some of you are hitting the nails with a Phillips screwdriver because you think that that's the tool for everything. Hobbes and Locke are important people, but not the right people to talk about for every scenario. They establish, you know, more so the political role of government, the social role. Should they control us or should they unleash our freedom? But if the conversation's about economics, you can talk about that a little bit, but then you must jump to Marx and Smith. So they're here. Rousseau's there as well. We've got some of the principles of liberalism. You should look for these. You know, in an A1 in -1 or an A2 in -2, is the source questioning liberalism? Well, if you just generally say it's pro-liberalism or anti-liberalism, that's a 60. What aspect of liberalism is it pro or anti? So all of these things in green here, like freedom, individualism, reason, justice, rule of law, equality of opportunity, tolerance. If you can see layers of that, you elevate your mark from a 60 to an 80. So in those writing assignments, rather than just saying this is pro or anti-liberalism, that's a general conversation. To get to more 80 or above, to more specific or precise, you have to be able to say, this is the value, or this is the principle of liberalism that's being celebrated, or this is the principle of liberalism that's being challenged or rejected. So those things are outlined here in green for you. Things like political correctness. We also have the spectrum so that we can begin to understand different ideologies. And students, I don't know why, because it's linear, maybe because you can visualize it, you overthink it. And again, you think that this is the entire course and everything must be labeled as one thing or another. It's more accurate to label it as individualist or collectivist or liberal or non-liberal than to try to force it into liberal or conservative. People are like, Adam Smith was a conservative. I'm like, you're wrong. He was a liberal. He was a classic liberal that was looking for economic change. You label him as a conservative, and now you're a 40 student. So trying to use these terms for every scenario shows some simplicity. You know, these are terms at the beginning of the course to kind of outline different categories of ideologies, but they're not always the best way to label them. But definitely we go into some detail here about classic versus modern liberalism, and I can see why you said contemporary, because that's how it's listed here. I'm such an idiot. I should never have done that. That's probably because I teach too much 10, and in 10 we talk about contemporary globalization. But yeah, you're going to see it as modern liberalism more times than not. But the term modern means contemporary, so I can see how that would overlap. Yeah. So we got lots of things here. In chapter 4, we introduce you to the Luddites and we introduce you to the Chartists. You're going to probably see those in the multiple choice in part B on both -1, -2. And you could see it in the first writing assignment in -1 and the second one in -2 as we show you perspectives. We might show you a Luddite response to liberalism. We might show you a Chartist response to liberalism. So you need to know their perspective. How did they feel about liberalism, and how are they going to resolve how they felt? So the Luddites wanted to reject it. They wanted to replace it with, let's go back to the cottage industry. So they use violence, so they're reactionaries. And the Chartists, they also saw problems with liberalism, but they thought that through democracy, they could resolve the economic problems like exploitation. These are used a lot on the A2s in -1. A lot of people, when they look at the will of the people, the essay that students wrote just last month here, they refer to the Chartist as an example politically of the people leading the government, saying this is what the people will, therefore government must put policies in place, and if they don't, then you're not really legitimate. You're not doing the will of the people. In chapter 4, we introduce you to socialism. Robert Owen gets a lot of attention on tests, more so than the term utopian socialist in general. But Karl Marx is the key socialist that we need to know about. And he's outlined very well in the textbook. We also have some stuff in here for you. Classic conservatives, I mentioned yesterday, that's just Edmund Burke, and then John Stuart Mill. So that's the majority of what's in that lesson. Jumping to lesson 3 and lesson 4, all those lessons did was talk about the spectrum in more detail. So nobody really had any questions about that, so I'm going to jump ahead and talk about what we're doing today. So today we're going to be looking at lesson 5 and 6. So after lesson 4, we're done related issue 1. After lesson 4, we're done the first unit of the year. So there's really, I would say 4 units. The intro, which we finished yesterday, and then an economic unit, a political unit, and then a unit that's really history-based. So we're done that first unit. Now, all 4 units are not created equal. This first unit might be 5% of the course. These ones are probably 45% each. And then maybe that last history one's like 5%. So this course is really about economics and politics. And we're about to dive into an economic unit. So lesson 5 is an introduction to economics that should look a lot like grade 9 social studies. And lesson 6 is a continuation of lesson 5. Lesson 5 and 6 are based upon chapter 4 of the textbook, but they also bleed a little bit into chapter 6. So after this lesson today, you need to be able to do these things. Connect economics to liberalism. If you don't see the connection, make me talk about that at 11 o'clock. Connect all economic systems to the concept of scarcity. If after looking at this document, you're like, I have no clue what scarcity is still, make me teach you that at 11 o'clock. Understand the Industrial Revolution and as it brings to existence classic liberalism, but also the challenges that came with it, and therefore why liberalism had to evolve, why the government had to play a bigger role. That'll include things like the Chartists, the Labor Acts, unions, and the age of the progressive era. It'll include individuals like muckrakers like Upton Sinclair and events like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. So for outcome 3, we need to begin to see this is why the Industrial Revolution was a good thing. This is all the good stuff that it created. And I would put that as evidence under capitalism's good. But then it's going to show all these bad things that happened, like workers being locked into a room. And then once there was a fire in the room, they were cooked to death. That's probably a pretty bad thing. That's a literal sweatshop. That would be capitalism's bad. So in these lessons today, you should be adding to your notes about capitalism's good and bad, or socialism's good or bad. The primary goal of economics, you can see this isn't in green. So I read it once, I'm like, whatever. But this is in green. So this is in green, so I might want to look at this and say, is this a theoretical argument that I could use to defend capitalism or to defend socialism, to attack socialism or to attack capitalism? And economically speaking, we have that middle category. Is this saying that there's needs to be a mixed? And this one's saying there needs to be a mixed. That in this, I can see that there is some reference to capitalism works, but then there's an inference to there's a time where it doesn't work, and therefore government must do something. So you could see this source on an exam, a part B, multiple choice, or in -1, you could see it as an A1. In -2, you wouldn't see it as a writing prompt. Adam Smith, we absolutely have to understand what his philosophy was. And this idea is one of a few quotes that you should be able to take into an exam with you and understand that this means self-interest. That's what it's saying. The concept of guns or butter and the role of government is outlined there as well. The 3 basic economic questions, how it would be answered in a free market versus a controlled market. These are notes that help you saying capitalism's good. These are notes saying that capitalism's bad. So maybe I would just copy and paste that into my inventory. So you'll leave lesson 5 with a understanding of capitalism and a better understanding of the Industrial Revolution. But if there's something here that you don't understand, like Chartists or the Factory Acts, then please ask about it. Otherwise, at 11 o'clock, we probably won't spend a lot of time on it. Definitely unions often strikes and unions often get some attention on the diploma exam. So you might see sources similar to these. And sometimes it's a source celebrating unions. Sometimes it's a source saying that unions are maybe a force of evil because they are taking the freedom away from the workers. That's a great cartoon too. So that is that lesson. Then the other lesson that we're looking at today is lesson 6. Once again, the objectives are in purple. The key things are in green. We need you to understand classic economic liberalism. See how I put the word economic there? Just so that we know we're talking about economics here. On the diploma exam, you won't see the word economic put in there. That's me being more precise. But classic liberalism is definitely something we need to know more about. So even though I talked about it at the beginning of this, you're still learning about it. You're not meant to be an expert yet. If you were, then you'd have a test right now. But that's one of the outcomes here today. Also, the idea of the challenges with economic liberalism, classic liberalism, and some of the solutions offered. Lesson 6 is a continuation of 5. In summer school, we do them both because it's really one lesson. At WCHS during the year, we can't do both because our classes are so short. So that's why they're divided. But in reality, it's a continuation of each other. There shouldn't be a division. That there's lots of great arguments here for and against capitalism. So as you read this, you should be putting it into that document of yours. And as you put it into the document, then when you eventually get an essay where you have to respond to capitalism, bring up your document, use it, and say, okay, wait a minute, capitalism's good because of this. Now you have all your notes done for you. So your essay is going to be brilliant. More detail about Luddites, Chartists, Robert Owen, the rise of capitalism, Karl Marx's ideas, lots of great stuff. This is going to go into more depth than chapter 4 does about the key ideological responses to classic economic liberalism. And for each one, you need to take note. Oh, this is what welfare capitalism is. Oh, I might see that term. How is that different than capitalism? How is that different? So we're going to see each other in an hour and a half at 11 o'clock. And at an hour and a half at 11 o'clock, we're going to talk about lessons 5 and 6. Maybe there's a cartoon that you don't understand. Maybe you want me to talk about that. If something comes up and you want me to focus on it, send me an email, because cartoons like this, that's exactly what we want to put on a diploma exam. That looks beautiful. And in that cartoon, there's an ideological perspective about capitalism, and there's an intended role of government because of the nature of mankind. All right, I'm going to stop recording. I'll stick around for a couple of minutes, but I need to go talk to my 20s soon, so I can't stick around for too long. Oh, I can't leave call. Hit the wrong button. Manage recording, that's the one. All right, anybody have any questions?